Brilliant. Hello, everybody, and welcome to December's Public Service Innovation Network. It's great to have you all with us today as we close out on another busy and successful year across the public service. So today's session is going to focus on a project that definitely kept us busy in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and that is the recently published and launched Design Principles for Government. So we're joined by 3 members of the working group, all experts in design, who came together this year to put together these principles. So we are delighted to be joined by Trevor Vaugh, who is the co-chair of the working group from Maynooth University, Siobhan Manning, Service Innovation and Design Lead from the Mater University Hospital, and John Lynch from Context Studio. So Trevor, Siobhan and John are going to share the 10 principles, how they were developed, and then further insight into each principle, and they'll be in conversation with each other for the duration of the session. So please do use the chat function to ask questions of Trevor, Siobhan and John. So we hope this session will be co-designed by the audience, and you are encouraged to ask questions and share comments with the panelists. We will also be sharing polls and questions throughout the session that we hope you will answer. These responses will also guide today's discussion. Finally, if you have any examples of design in the public service, good or bad, please do share those through the chat box with the panelists today. So please do engage with us and feel free to share your name or remain anonymous. So before I hand over to Trevor, who will host the session, I want to share some information on the design principles. So we've had a lot of interest in this event today with over 500 people registered to join. So for some people in attendance, you will already be aware of design and perhaps have used and continue to use some of these principles that we are sharing today in your roles. For others, this might be the first time that you are engaging with the word and the concept of design in the public service, and this might be a word that we are unfamiliar with or maybe perhaps a little bit uncomfortable with, but it is important to remember that every day as public servants we are involved in the design of public services, policies, legislation and responses to the needs of our citizens. So design, intentional or unintentional, is everywhere in the public service, and these principles that will be shared shortly are the first attempt to bring together key ideas around design of services in the public service in Ireland. So the design approach that you're about to hear places the user and citizen at the centre, values co-creation and consultation, and uses evidence instead of assumption. Applying these principles will enable the public service to design and provide services that are citizen-centred, simple, accessible, seamless, effective, and represent value for money. One project that will use the design principles is the significant digital transformation programme being undertaken by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, led out by the Office of the Government's Chief Information Officer. So the Life Events portal, which is outlined in the Connecting Government strategy, provides for a human-centred service that is based on the various life events that we as citizens experience. This digital portal will enable access to significant life events that will require you to interact and engage with the state, such as registering a birth. This programme kicked off last week with a workshop that was attended by representatives from across the public sector who, with the design principles in mind, input into how this life events portal should be designed. I expect that you will hear more about this significant programme in the new year. So the design principles, which are available on our website, ops.gov.ie, are a prototype document in true design fashion. And we hope that you can provide your input, thoughts and suggestions on how these principles can be shaped, implemented and improved. We welcome any and all feedback. And if any of the ideas resonate with you, if you see opportunities for improvement, or if you think something might be missing, please do let us know by emailing design@per.gov.ie, and I will put that in the chat button or the chat box so people can remember that. So I'm really excited by this design-led approach, and I know that a lot of our innovation network will be too. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Trevor, who will host the rest of this session. So Trevor, over to you.
Great. Thanks a million, Jade, and good morning, everybody. Just give me a minute to get the slide deck working. Little nod there if that's working. Anyone? Great. The usual 3 years in and we're still asking. So good morning and thanks, Jade. Design. This is very exciting for me and for John and Siobhan and for everybody who is on the working group developing this. It's kind of like a dream come true for people who've been kind of practicing design for many years and have seen the value that it can bring to all sorts of organizations challenges and opportunities. And so it's my absolute pleasure to co-chair this group with a group of really excellent public servants and designers, um, because it is important work. Um, we are at a time in, I guess, in history where we need to start rethinking how we do things, questioning if how we develop our services, improve our services, deliver value to the citizens of Ireland. Uh, are we doing it right? Um, are we doing it in the right way? Are we working in the right way? And we saw uh, from our own experience and from evidence that design is a highly effective way of delivering that value. So a quick overview of what we're going to do today up until about 1 o'clock. Um, Jade's already given an introduction to myself, John, and Siobhan. I'm going to take you through a very quick presentation introducing the government design principles and a little bit about how they were developed. And then we'll move into a kind of about a 20-minute conversation between myself, John, and Siobhan, where we'd love your input. We're going to have a chat about some of the kind of elements of these principles and the reason they exist. But we'd love your feedback, your involvement, and as Jade says, kind of help us co-create this event. And we'll be keeping an eye on the chat. Talk a little bit about next steps, kind of where these design principles fit in a much bigger journey, and it's an important journey. So we'll touch on that. And then there should be about 15-20 minutes at the end where we'd love for you to turn on your cameras, turn on your microphone, and just come in and have a chat with us. Kind of, we'd love to hear your views on the principles. And then throughout, we're going to be popping in a couple of questions through the poll function on WebEx. Again, just this is really important. It is nearly a principle of design that we it can't be just kind of creating something for people. It has to be with. So we'd love you to be able to guide this discussion a little bit. I have this quirk that I've done for years, and that is to kind of pick up any kind of strategy document, development plan, and search for the word design. I've done it for years, and I've always been quite disappointed by the fact that it's mentioned so many times, but I always get the feeling it's just a convenient word. It's not kind of the true kind of process of design, or doesn't take advantage of the true potential of design. And I'm hoping that these principles might begin to change that. When we use the word design, we will have kind of it'll be action based on the principles of design, the process of design, the mindset of design. So hopefully, if we come back in next year and the following years, we're going to start to see design kind of moving into all of the development plans that you read and you work on. That's the intention. But it's a really important time to bring in new approaches, different approaches, slightly different ways of working. And we're all very familiar with the challenges that are facing government and public sectors, everything from just the complexity of life, the complexity of the problems, the uncertainty about what's going to happen next year, let alone in 5 years' time. We're seeing radical change, both social change and technological change. The expectations of the citizens, the people who live in Ireland, they're changing. They're changing rapidly as a result of the top two things, but also as a result of this kind of massive polarization and fragmentation of opinion. Someone said it recently, what we see across the water in the States and around the world, that's coming to Ireland. We're just a little bit behind. And I think kind of bringing in approaches like design might help us get ahead of that. And kind of what I've experienced and what kind of the panelists have experienced using design, implementing design in all sorts of organizations, it builds a relationship, a different type of relationship with the people you're designing for. And that could be very useful for the eroding trust that we know is happening with the public. We also know that kind of when you frame a problem, a challenge, or an opportunity as a design challenge, something changes. It brings new energy to them, to those challenges. It also allows us to ask slightly different questions, new questions, and if we ask new questions, maybe we'll get to new answers. And so I was thrilled to work with this incredible team of people from across the public and private sector, and we embarked on a process of design. We were asked to look at developing a set of principles, and we took a design approach to doing that. So over a couple of months, we went through the kind of at a high level the phases of design. So starting with kind of aligning the team around a vision, an aspiration for what we wanted to do, the objective, and kind of reading everything we could that was published by our colleagues around the world in relation to design in government, design in public sector. We then spoke to people who were involved in the creation and delivery of public services, hear their points of view, kind of see what's working, what's not working. And once we had a pretty good amount of information there, we defined the problem. So we did some thematic analysis of the findings. You can see the kind of dizzying Miro board we used to work on these principles. We look for the patterns, we look for the themes that were emerging to allow us to frame a direction for this document, this set of principles. We then ideated or brainstormed together to identify kind of what needs are we addressing, what do these principles need to do, kind of developing kind of quite a large set of principles. We knew we didn't want kind of 20, 30 different principles. We needed to bring it down to probably the 10 principles that we felt would have the most, would resonate the most, would have the most impact. We then prototyped different directions. So we split off into different groups and developed two completely different documents and reviewed them together to see which elements were working, which principles kind of would best meet the objective that we're trying to reach. And then a slow process, but important process of iterating, kind of amalgamating the prototypes, building kind of higher fidelity prototypes, and improving them based on feedback. So we took the exact same approach that we're promoting, that everybody starts looking at and trying to embrace. We know that kind of every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And if we think about our own organizations, our own departments, if it's not working, if there's something that is not as efficient, effective, if it's not kind of adding the value that you think it should have for your customers, for your users, it's probably being designed or not designed. Edward Deming said every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And design is that key word. It's a word that we use regularly, but often don't think about the process behind it. We don't think about it as a way of working, a set of principles, a set of mindsets. Yeah. But in saying that, there is actually a huge amount of design happening in the public sector already. These principles aren't new. There's people who are kind of using the principles, using the process of design without even knowing it. It comes natural to them. We call that silent design. There's an awful lot, however, or unfortunately, of kind of unintentional design and incidental design. We're hoping that these principles will allow kind of all of you to reflect and think, am I actually designing? Is there better ways of doing what I want to do? Could I bring in some of these principles into the way I work? It's also it's a slightly different approach than maybe traditional approaches to developing services, to improving services, to working day to day. And this table has been kind of amalgamated from lots of different sources, and a few of them that I really like. Kind of a traditional approach is really seeking out well-defined goals and constraints, but a design-led approach, kind of goals and constraints are uncovered throughout the design process. A traditional approach might put the organization at its center and the user as a very important factor, but design would say the user is at the center. It has to be at kind of front and center of everything we do. A traditional approach might take a linear approach, almost like a waterfall approach, whereas design is about iteration, it's about frequent adaptations. And whereas a traditional approach might be formal and hierarchical, design approach would be flexible, collaborative, and inclusive. All of this is in the Design Principles for Government in Ireland report, which is available on the OPS website. So after months of work, kind of hours of debate, kind of weeks of research, we identified these 10 principles, and these are, in true design fashion, they're a prototype. These are the principles that we think, at the moment, without kind of putting them into practice widely across the public sector, these are the principles that we think are important. I'm going to walk you through them one by one. There's lots more information on them in that document, but kind of, I suppose the first one, we will design to put people first. I suppose, what is a principle? First of all, a principle is this kind of truth. It's this guide to kind of bring you somewhere. It's a way of thinking without being a rule. It's a way of kind of knowing how to act, kind of guiding your decision making, kind of aligning to your purpose, your visions. And so we developed these principles to help guide you. They're not telling you to do anything. They're guiding you to what design is. And before I get on to explaining them one by one, I think it's important to say the objective is not to scale design in the public sector. We're not trying to kind of put a new way of working, a new kind of approach into your already busy lives. We're trying to scale slightly new ways of listening, new ways of collaborating, new ways of experimenting, and ways of delivering meaningful values and meaningful outcomes for the people of Ireland. We just know from research and from experience that design is a highly effective way of doing that. So, back on track. Principle one, we will put people first. And this really speaks to the important idea that we have to start with citizen needs. We have to start with the people who are using our services. To do that, we have to leave our offices. We need to talk to them. We have to kind of understand what their hopes, dreams, goals, motivations, their needs, their unarticulated needs are. And to do that, we get out and we talk to them. And we let that insight and that understanding guide what we do. We will design to be inclusive. Anybody who wants to use our services, anybody who needs to use our services, should be able to use our services. And so we have to design with those people and those needs in mind. Principle three, we will design services together. This speaks to co-creation, working with our colleagues in our own units, in our own departments, but outside of our own departments, kind of working together with the common goal of delivering value. To do that, we have to share knowledge, share insight, kind of figure out what piece of the puzzle that we can contribute to the bigger goal, which is delivering better services. We will design for trust. Trust comes from relationships. It comes from transparency. It comes from kind of showing that you are reliable, that you've considered needs, that you've created your service to align to those needs. We will design so knowledge can be reused and shared. There's some lovely examples already where units within the public sector, departments within the public sector, are creating kind of amazing insight. They're finding amazing insight. They're turning them into personas. They're sharing the document that allowed them to get to that insight. And we need to do more of that. We need to kind of take all this learning that we're going to get, that we have, and allow our colleagues from across the public sector to be able to use that. And that also comes down to the failures that we have and the successes. Kind of, this has to be a learning public sector where we're not repeating work, where we're open with what we're using, and we're open with what's working and what's not working. Principle 6, I think this is really important. We will challenge assumptions and design with evidence. Too often we rely on the orthodoxies that exist in our department, the ways we do things, kind of the way it's always been done. And some of them are just plain wrong, or they're no longer true for the times we're living. We have to be open about kind of what those assumptions are. We have to question kind of, is what we're doing still the right way of doing, or have things changed? And we need to kind of use the evidence we get from all of the previous principles, from talking to people, from understanding people, from sharing the evidence, use that to rethink what we do in the future. Again, an important principle and critically important in the design process is we will design from the top down and the bottom up. There's often a misconception that innovation and design happens at the front line, and it does, but it needs to also happen at the very top and in the middle of our organizations. And that's not just support from the top or air cover, giving permission for kind of frontline staff to be brave and to try new ways of working. We also need to practice design at the very top in how we design policy, on how we manage, on how we kind of make our organizations work better. Principle 8, we will design to deliver value in all its forms. So we know, again, there's a huge amount of evidence saying that design can, and design approaches, all types of design approaches, can kind of save money, create better value. Well, design is kind of first and foremost about kind of people and delivering value for people. It can also make our services much more effective. It can identify kind of redundancies in how we work. It can identify kind of places where we can improve. So we can add value to people's lives, but we can also add value for money. Principle 9, we will build, test, learn, and iterate. And I think kind of from my experience anyway, kind of we often don't do this enough. You know, we plan and kind of try to figure out kind of the most effective thing we can do, and then we launch it, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We have to take smaller steps. We have to kind of be faster at learning. To do that, we have to experiment more. We have to build prototypes. We have to kind of put those prototypes out in front of people, get feedback, learn from them, and iterate our way towards something better. And then finally, principle 10, we will work to make things simpler. I think sometimes we forget how complicated life is. And while we're on one side of a service, the people who are using that service are living very complicated lives. They're doing a lot more than just trying to complete our forms and use our systems and engage with our service. People are busy, people are stressed, and we have to think, is this the most effective way of doing what we do? Can we make it simpler? Can we kind of work through the complexity to make it simpler? And that's not just our own services, that's kind of where it fits into the bigger ecosystem. So it's a very high level, rapid overview of the principles. I think there should be some poll questions going out, but I'm going to turn over to John and Siobhan, who were incredibly valuable members of the team and passionate about design and the importance of design, not just in public sector, in all walks of life. John and Siobhan, have you recovered from the the process of developing these principles?
Getting there, Trevor.
Yeah, I think it's they were really hard actually. It was much harder than I expected. And I think it's hard because it's difficult to make them very accessible to people. I have in my mind all the time people that are completely new to this. So it's trying to make it distill it all down in a way that is accessible to people. So it's not easy.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I'll ask kind of the same question to both of you, and you can decide who answers first. But kind of, kind of, why principles? Do you know, like, there's lots of different ways we could have gone about introducing design into the public sector, but kind of why was it important to develop principles? Um, why now? Like, why is it important to release this set of design principles in Ireland? For Ireland, for the Irish public sector. And sorry for loading on three different three questions, but they should all link together. Kind of, what do you hope the impact will be, short term or long term? You know, John, do you want to?
I can try
first?
to take that. I should probably start by saying that in my background, I just had seen design work in both the public and private sector in the UK and in Denmark, and came home and have had the lucky opportunity through my own company of working with the public sector in Ireland to bring design in. So we had trialed the idea of principles in a number of places, and others had done it before that. But I think the key thing about principles is that they're there to guide as opposed to instruct or force change. There's a great talk I saw a few years ago by Des Traynor, who's one of the founders of Intercom. He did it for Enterprise Ireland. And he talked about how principals work in their organization, which of course is a global tech company.
Yeah.
And for him, it was about helping people make decisions, and helping people make decisions right from the top of an organization or structure right to the bottom. Because when you read these principles, you can ask yourself honestly, are we using this principle? Are we doing something in line with this principle? And it's a nice way to start. But the other thing to nod to is the fact that, you know, we're not the first. Other countries have used principles. They've called them principles. They've called them playbooks. It's a great place to start, and it's also important to get feedback on these principles as we go forward. I'm sure maybe in Siobhan, you've got examples from the healthcare sector that come to mind.
Sorry, John, examples specific. What do you mean? Say that again.
Like I wonder if you sense check against principles, does it work in healthcare as well as it's worked in other places, that you can say, look, are we using those right now, kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. Like I think when you first read the principles, for me, the principles are kind of, they're just somewhere to start with design. You're not going to read them and suddenly go, oh, I get it now, and I'm revolutionized in how I'm going to change public services. But it's just a start, and there's sort of, I suppose they're almost like the core values of design or something like that, or the stuff that design will add to public services if we get it right. Yeah, definitely. Like, I'd say every single one of them we've kind of lived through the last. So just for people that we started dabbling around with design, I suppose, maybe 6 or 7 years ago at the Matter, and instantly connected with it as a way of solving some of our problems. It doesn't solve all problems. We use other methodologies too, but it sort of instantly was shone light on old problems that we'd been battling with for years. And I would say all of the principles in some way, like just looking at them, putting people first, like, so being patient centered is something that we've talked about for years and years in healthcare, and it is the beginning of every document ever written about healthcare is we will be patient centered, but actually making that a reality is really difficult. And when I started getting into design puts a new lens on it that really forces you to start with the patient, and helps that to start to become a reality. So yeah, I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, John, but as I read every one of them, then just sort of like the building, testing, iterating, I think that's something that we didn't do very well before. What we tend to do was plan, accompanied by many Gantt charts, many meetings. And it was as if we just logic this out, we will, and control it within an inch of its life, we will surely succeed. And we didn't succeed in many cases. Whereas design is much freer and more fluid, and kind of listens to the reality of what's happening as you try to implement and responds to it as you move through. So that one really, but they all resonate in different ways. But yeah, does that answer you? Sort of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So would you say kind of we will put people first, design to put people, was that, do you think that was the principle that if you can grasp that, that unlocked design for you, or was there, can you
Yeah, I
remember back?
probably would. I'd say that's probably the fundamental one because, as I say, it was something that anybody that works in healthcare will say they ascribe to that value, but design gave us a way of actually doing it. But because it starts by talking, it's very simple. It starts with talking to patients and staff members because they're also part of the service to really understand what's going on, and that's where you begin. You don't have all the senior people sitting around at committees talking about based on their assumptions, and there's another principle based on their assumptions of what works in healthcare, making decisions and then sort of issuing a decree on how things will be into the future, and that just keeps failing for certain challenges. It doesn't work. Whereas by actually putting people first, and by that going to people and talking to them and finding out what their needs are and beginning there. It changed the conversation. So that's probably the number one for me. I think it's because it gives you a real way of doing that.
Yeah. And John, like I know all 10 principles work together, they're all important. Is there one in particular that you think if we can focus on that, if we can really get our head around that, if we can really put that into practice, that is the essence of design?
Yeah, you're asking me a question I don't want to answer because they do all connect.
Yeah.
I do have to think in terms of emphasis, what might be an important one to hold on to. And I mean, having done work now here in Ireland with the Department of Justice, with Cork County Council, with Dublin City Council, there's sort of one thing that always comes forward as different about the design approach, and that's principle number three, which is we'll design services together. And that to me is really crucial because it's not just, and it's great, as we heard Siobhan say, it's great to be user-centric in the case of healthcare, it's patient-centric. But when you're designing services, which is what I do, it doesn't matter if you're designing a form, if you're designing a whole computer system, or if you're designing a reception area in a building, unless you talk to the people who are going to both use it as users, but also work in it and help to deliver the service, unless you account for all of those perspectives, you're setting yourself up for that thing of plan, consider, assume, launch, and then, it's reactive from then on out. So I think designing together is really important, but it actually did, and I do want to lean into one more principle because part of the process of designing together is to prototype, and principle, where is it? They have it in front of you. Principle 9, to build, test, and iterate. That's almost anathema to the way we've always worked with public sector projects. The thoughts of showing somebody something that's not finished and asking them to give feedback so you can learn is quite difficult to a cultural barrier to overcome. But there's already been questions in the chat. There's ways to do that. You can be honest and say it's a test. You can limit the pool of people you test with. There's lots of ways to build, test, and iterate while designing together. And those two, to me, they're sort of the magic of design that help to sort of really put, for want of a pandemic metaphor, a shot in the arm of people who are trying to solve problems.
Yeah, I might dig into that a little bit. I think the Des Trainer example was really good. This idea of they give permission, their kind of guidance to give people permission, and I think it relates to Gillian's question in the chat. Kind of failure is accepted in design, but it's not accepted in government or public service. It's seen as wasteful, waste of resource and taxpayers' money. Do you think, and Siobhan as well, do you think kind of because it is now a government design principles, a government design principle, that does give some air cover? Is it the beginning of of shifting how people see kind of waste and experimentation and iteration, failure?
It's the beginning, I think, but very much just the beginning. It's funny though, the thing about perceptions of failure. The weird thing is, I think the public services have done plenty of failing in the past. So I think there's sort of an idea that this is more of a risky method, but it's not been my personal experience at all, because you start to test so quickly that you're not doing a big massive launch after 6 months of planning where something dies a sort of lukewarm death over time. Like that's the failure that we certainly, I can speak from experience, that that's the failure that often happens, where things are launched and then they sort of just peter out slowly over time, or engagement is poor. And there's loads of that. So this to me is actually less risky. But I do hear, I think you said it was Gillian who asked that question, and I'd like to know more about their other people's experiences. Maybe I'm different to what others in the public service think. Maybe others do feel a fear of failure, or have felt when they work with design that there is more failure. I certainly don't think that there is.
Yeah, I think we have to frame it's how you frame it. Like
Yeah.
failure is always going to sound like a negative thing, but experiments always sound like a positive, progressive thing. And like this isn't about failing fast and failing often. It's learning fast and learning often.
I think that's it. It's putting something in front of the person that you're going to rely on to use it, engage with it, implement it. Put it in front of them soon. That's literally all it is. And you just iterate it, you change it based on what they tell you. So maybe using failure around that is you're right, is not a great way of framing it, because it sort of suggests there's no waste there. There's far less waste than there is with the other method, which is just plan it to within an inch of its life and then hope that it succeeds. So maybe it's kind of a language thing.
I'd
John, you
say
want to jump in?
just there's definitely a legacy there, because we all know, because we've lived in the country most of our lives, when we think of failure, we think of big, slow, expensive failures. But actually, what we're talking about here are small, quick, rapid learnings.
Yes.
It's the inverse, and there is a bit of legacy in that language for sure, I think.
Good. So we're for a lot of people here, we're putting kind of something brand new in front of them, design and these principles. I'm sure there's a lot of kind of brains trying to figure out kind of would this work, thinking about the things that might go wrong, how they're going to convince someone to allow them to experiment with this. Have you any advice, John? And I'll start with you, John, and go over to you, Siobhan. How do they how do you start? How do you go about kind of starting to live these principles, bringing them into a project that's going on at the moment that you're thinking has to be rethought, redesigned?
Am I first? Sorry.
Kind of, if someone is considering now, okay, I'm convinced, or I think there's something in these principles. Kind of, where do they start? How do they apply it to their next project? How do they kind of dip their toe in the water?
I think the small things you do to try. We had great examples during the Design and Government Conference earlier this year, and some from the Matter, which I'm sure Siobhan can talk about, where a small effort in the space of a week, using something like interviews to talk to potential customers or users, cheap prototypes, new signage, measure the outcome, and then scale the approach. It's a lot easier to do than you might think, but I do think you can't underestimate that we're on a journey. Um, these principles are I don't know, they're a starting line, I suppose. Um, but over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, it's going to be about using those small measures to defeat inertia for most people. For the majority in your day-to-day job, it's about saying, do you know what? I'm actually going to try and talk to people. I actually saw a question come in. How do you find users before a service is launched? The good news in public sector is you're surrounded by the public,
Yeah.
and you can get permission to go and show them a sketch or a mock-up or a form or whatever it might be. So this very, very small actions, but it'll be characterized, I expect, and I'm being totally blunt here, by also working against the inertia of what we normally do already. So it's hard. I remember when I started doing design, the hardest thing was to go and talk to people. It was not in my, I'm a software guy, so I was a heads down kind of person. It's hard to talk to people. It's hard to go over the silo to the next person who needs to deliver the next step of the service and bring them involved. It's hard to show unfinished work and learn from it. Um, and always against the traditional methods. So I think there's a bit to be done of small steps for everybody. But then I also think that inertia, it's for managers to say, is business as usual getting in the way of these principles? Is my instinctive thing I've been doing for 15 years stopping somebody from testing something or from putting their hand up when they have an idea? And it needs to come that top up, top up, and top down, bottom
Top
up.
down, bottom up.
Yeah, that needs to happen too. But I would say start small, and there's so much out there. I'm seeing questions rattling through the chat, and I'm like, here's how you could start. We can't answer it all in one go, but reach out to the people who've been doing this both in the public and private sector, because the design community is quite generous in its knowledge. We do work in the open, and that hopefully will get people started. There's even in the principles book itself, there's already examples from the Irish public sector.
Siobhan, any advice or guidance?
Yeah, I mean, what I would probably say, I suppose I can only speak from my own experience and journey with trying to grow design or seeing the potential of design. What I'd say is, read or try and find out about examples of when design has been applied somewhat successfully in something similar to your area, because that sort of starts to get your head thinking about where design is particularly good. And then, but the other thing I'd say is try and just find a way of working with a designer on a challenge. And that's because once you start to actually just do it, you'll start to deeply understand its potential. You'll start to really understand the design process, but really importantly, if you measure the success of that project well, you'll start to build the case for design and you'll start to get support really quickly. Like, you know, in the small number of years that we've been using design at the hospital, people get really excited when they see what design can do to solve old problems. And we've got such diversity of stuff that people are trying to tackle, like for example, there's in the older person's ward in the hospital, somebody came to us describing problems for how the clinical environment can make it really difficult for patients with, say, delirium or dementia, because there's just so much about the environment that's just distressing for them. So we asked designers actually just in a 1 week sprint to take a look at that and try to understand the experience of the ward from the perspective of somebody with a confusion or with dementia, and to come up with suggestions. And the outputs were just so different to any ideas that the healthcare staff had come up with before. And that's okay. They're healthcare staff, their expertise is different. But they were so buzzed and so excited. They just drove that forward after that. They stayed in touch with the design students, but mainly they just started banging down doors to raise small amounts of funds and get the support of people. And when others then saw what they delivered, they got excited, and then other projects completely different. We did much bigger one, say in stroke, that I've spoken about before, where we invested more significant amounts of money. Now we had to source that funding ourselves, but investing significant amounts of money to really show what design can do when you do it at scale, but measuring the impact. And slowly then the people around you and the powers that be start to get excited and start to understand what it can do. So what I'd say is just find one way of doing one design project, and it'll hopefully grow from there.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Kind of my own experience trying to bring it into higher education. It's the exact same thing. You're trying to convince people, and it's hitting deaf ears. But you show them one good example, even small.
Okay. I think it's a real show, don't tell.
Yeah.
You just find a way of doing it, and it'll speak for itself then. But an important thing when you do that, if you certainly, I don't know what other sectors are like, but in healthcare, you have to prove everything. You know, you have to demonstrate that behavior changed, that you saved money, that experience is much better. You have to measure, measure, measure. So that's just a really important thing to keep in mind. But anybody who just interacts with the new service will get excited as well. But it's always really good to have the numbers too.
Absolutely. John, I might kind of, I know you probably saw the comment from Claire. I know you love surveys and focus groups, but I think it's important as almost like a threshold concept for design. Like we sometimes think if, okay, we're talking about humans, we're talking about people, we're going to put them first. Let's send out a survey or bring a load of them into a room. Uh, do you think, do you want to take that one as to why maybe it might not be the best approach for getting that insight and engaging with people?
You singled me out on that one, Trevor.
I know you love it.
I passionately, because, and I'll tell a story. The first time I worked on a service design project as a student, it was for an airport in Denmark. And my colleagues, who were much better than I was, they kept encouraging me to go and talk to a passenger in the airport. And I was too outright shy to do it, to the point where they brought me over to a man in a suit at a bar, and I actually veered away to avoid the conversation. And it was just physical fear, and we all have it. It's very, very difficult to face a person in real life and talk to them about their experience. So it's easier to throw out a survey. It's easier to gather data anonymously in the background based on pulse surveys and things like that. But at different points in the design process, it's much, much richer to talk to people. And the thing I'll finish on is there's this beautiful diagram, which I can find somewhere online if I can. But it was by a company in a Denmark-based company called Design It, who are now global. And they have a diagram where they have 100 dots and they pull 10 of them down to the bottom. And it says, ask 90 people and you will prove 10 things. So you will know for sure about 10 things. But if at the start of your design process you talk to just 10 people, and I know this because I've experienced it, you'll uncover 90 possibilities that you may never have understood existed before. So it's about the right tool for the right time. And while talking to 10 people doesn't sound like an awful lot, it can unearth a huge amount of potential. And that's why there's a nuance to how you do that information gathering depending on where you are in a process.
Yeah. Oh, go on, Siobhan, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that is completely spot on. I think when you start with a survey, you've just started with assumptions, because the questions that you're asking are, unless they're completely open questions, which isn't really a survey then, it's basically an interview on paper. But if your questions are, do you A, B, C, or D, you've already built in assumptions about what the options are and you've closed it down. So I totally agree. If you start, you could do surveys, but maybe a little bit later. I would find it much better to just start with open questions with examples of the users, or who you think. And sometimes we just kind of say, okay, so we want to represent a 60-year-old man, and somebody just goes and talks to their dad. Like, it can be really simple place to start, and then you can build it up if you want to validate it. But just starting with simple conversations with people with open questions, not do you agree that it would be great to create a video to support educate, because then you've just basically spoon-fed them your assumption, but genuinely open questions, and it can really open it right up at the beginning. It's pretty illuminating.
Yeah, I think that's for me why design kind of I'm trying to think of another word other than infects organizations. It's why it spreads so easily across organizations and across people, because it just makes sense. It's a very human way of looking at the problems. It's about conversations, it's about empathy, it's about kind of doing what comes naturally to humans that maybe we've forgotten about, which is experimentation and trying things out and kind of ultimately trying to kind of deliver value to make someone happy or to improve their situation. And so once you start doing it, and I'm sure that was the case for you, Siobhan, when you started really seeing, actually, this is giving us better answers or different answers,
Different answers, yeah.
but also kind of my team is enjoying working this way. You know, it's fun. It's different. It's a very human way of a team working. I think that's why once you dip your toe in it, once you kind of take the first step, trying these principles or a design approach on even a small challenge, it quickly kind of becomes obvious that this is a better way of working, different way of working.
Somebody mentioned there, actually, I can't remember who it was, about skepticism around it, and that is very real, and that it can make you feel very afraid of taking this type of approach, or like, are the sort of serious senior people going to view this as sort of fluffy and a bit. So the best way around that, again, is just to pick a valued problem, work with a designer, and then involve them, and then quite quickly that skepticism goes away. I think it's the only answer. I don't think you can kind of talk them into believing in design. I think they have to experience it.
Great. We have a few minutes left. I might turn to the audience. I'm trying to keep up and navigate WebEx at the same time. But if anybody would like to kind of turn on their camera and jump on and just ask a question about the principles or about kind of anything you've heard today, or kind of challenge our experts here on introducing design, please feel free to.
Trevor, just to let you know that people won't be able to
Sorry.
unmute. No, it's okay. But there's actually loads of questions in the chat box. If you can see those, if you can read through them all, there's a lot of questions in the chat box. But
I'm only seeing 6 for some reason.
I think you're in the Q&A section. So if you there should be a little chat icon there. I don't know if Siobhan or John can see that as well. There's loads of questions there that and I can read out some in a second. But while I have the mic, I will just share some of the answers that we got to the polls, just to let you know kind of what people were responding to. The first question that we asked were, what are your reactions to the design principles? And you'll be delighted to hear that they were all very positive reactions. So people think these are good guidance, you know, holistic, relevant, informative. They read like common sense. It's an exciting new approach for the public service, very relevant. Can't wait to use them. Very clear, very ambitious, well structured, makes a lot of sense, and very, very motivating. So we got a lot more responses, which I'll share with the working group afterwards. But they're just some of the kind of initial thoughts people had about the principles. When it comes to principles that people were a bit unsure about, I suppose the one that jumps out the most is definitely the designing from the top down and bottom up. And I think you have reflected on that a little bit in your conversation. But I think that's the one that people want to know, you know, how do we actually implement this in kind of traditional hierarchical structures within the public service? What does this mean? How do we go about it? So that might be something that we can look at in the new year, is really supporting people to design top down, bottom up. And then the last poll that we asked was about what people would like support on, and definitely hearing examples and case studies that use the principles has jumped out as the most important to people. And I just will say as well that if you do look at the document, which is on our website, and I'll send it around after the session, there are a lot of examples included in that already, but we can absolutely find more and share more. So they're the responses to the polls. I don't know if you got a chance to look at the questions in the chat, Trevor, if you want to take some of those.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Perfect.
I think there was one quite interesting one. Sorry, they're all very interesting, and I think Siobhan just said we can try and respond offline, but they'll also kind of I suppose that document that we keep referring to is a prototype. So these questions and this engagement will help kind of the next phase. So where we might be able to address some of these comments. But I particularly like the aren't we just championing qualitative research over quantitative research? I suppose it is kind of relates back to John and Siobhan's answer on survey and why we value the qualitative. But I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, John or Siobhan.
I think that, you're absolutely right. It definitely pushes the qualitative stuff much more, but also probably much more informal qualitative than we traditionally think of when we think of qualitative research. But what I would say is we've talked an awful lot here about the research stage, but it's only the first step in the design process. So I think there's a lot more to design after that piece of research is done. And by the way, that research is done throughout the process, but there's so much more to the kind of double diamond approach as you work through problem solving using design. Somebody just asked a quick question about what would you define as a designer. When I'm talking about working with a designer, I'm talking about kind of a qualified professional designer. It's not the only way of applying design, but for me, that's been critical in growing it. And so I would definitely recommend doing that.
If I could follow that briefly, there is, and it's often interpreted as being championing qualitative. I think it's just because qualitative has traditionally been the poorer cousin of quantitative. But I have a graph which shows sort of the importance of qualitative at the beginning and the increasing importance of quant as you start to deploy a service or deploy a redesigned experience. Because the small changes you learn to make through qualitative engagement at the start might have scaled impact. The great example was Cork County Council 5 years ago using service design and ended up saving staff members 2 days in their week. And if you don't measure that kind of impact quantitatively, you're going to look a fool. So it's hugely important. I think reiterating Siobhan's point, it's not just about the qual, but qual, I always was told, is about getting inspiration and possibility and empathy for the situation that both staff and users are in. Whereas quant is about proving the bottom line at the end of the day and ensuring then when a service is live that quality is upheld. Because if you see a change in the numbers, it's probably because something has changed in the quality of the service.
Yeah, and I know from academia they're almost very often seen as kind of opposites and almost portrayed as there's a lack of kind of, if you do one, it's lesser than the other. And so we've treated them as others, as two different things. But I suppose the beautiful thing about design, as you've just kind of articulated, John and Siobhan, kind of it merges the two. There's an important place for qualitative, the human insight, the why, and an equally important place for the what and kind of what is the impact. And so I think Roger Martin talks about kind of validity and intuitiveness. We need this validity, which comes from logical, rational, kind of quantitative thinking, but we need that kind of human side of things as well. And kind of design just kind of sits there in the middle, finds the balance. We're all just staring at these questions.
Actually, yeah, I'm just hypnotized by the questions. I'd
I
love
know
to.
there's some lovely ones. We're just past 1 o'clock. I don't know if you're happy, John and Siobhan. We can continue. This is recorded. We could give it another 5 minutes if there's anything there that you want to, either of you want to address.
I just see one very small one. I can't answer it, but I want to draw attention to it. Brian has asked, jumping into the future, how can we go to the layer above and design policy with users and citizens? There's a beautiful. I'm all full of my diagrams, but there's a beautiful. Uh, you can search it online. The stratification of design thinking, and at the bottom is what we all are familiar with: jewelry, fashion, furniture, all those things that we're familiar with in design. Above is user experience and service design, and then the very top is policy. And it's not to say that any of them are more important, but they're all dependent on another. So I'm glad, Brian, you mentioned the future. An eventual destination, and it's done in other countries, is that we would have really heavy involvement of people in the way we design policy. But I actually think, and I haven't done the reading on it, I think our Citizens Assembly is a good example of some design principles being applied to the design of policy at the very highest level. So we're maybe not as far behind as we think.
Yeah, like I'll do a John and refer to another diagram, the Danish design ladder.
Yes.
Kind of, I think before this principle document, before kind of OPS's move towards design and bringing design into our public sector, we were kind of on the bottom ring, which is no design, or design as kind of maybe styling. Kind of, we'd make beautiful reports and we'd present the the work that we produce as a government and our public service in a nice way, but we weren't using design to design policy to kind of work on our initiative. Very quickly, we're moving up the rings of that Danish design ladder towards kind of policy, towards strategy, and kind of already we're seeing kind of the work that Jade pointed out in terms of life events. When that kind of is able to demonstrate the value of these design principles, we're seeing lots of smaller projects starting to use these principles, which is kind of layered on top of the already great examples that are coming out of the matter with Siobhan and the court service, places like that. I think very quickly we will start moving up that ladder towards the country where we see design as an integral part of how we develop our services and create our policy. So with that, I might hand it back to you, Jade, if that's okay, if there's anything else you'd like to finish on.
Thanks a lot for that, Trevor. And I know there's still loads of questions that have come in, but we have captured all the questions, so we might look at them after this session, and if we can make any responses, we will. But I just want to thank you for joining us today. Trevor, John, and Siobhan, and of all the attendees that took the time out to join us. I thought it was a really interesting session. I think this is a really exciting concept, and I know that came across when we put the poll out there as well. People are excited about this. They're looking forward to getting stuck in, and they're looking forward to kind of using them in their public service and seeing how they're used in other public bodies. As Trevor mentioned, this is a new way of, I suppose, listening and collaborating across the public service. And I really liked, Siobhan, you mentioned that this is just somewhere to start, you know, that we shouldn't be scared by it. It's just a starting point, and it can help us build the case for design in the work that we do. So before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that we really do want your feedback on the document. So any kind of feedback you gave today, whether it's through a poll or through the chat function or through a question, and we have captured all of that. And like Trevor said, that will be fed back into the prototype document and kind of as it develops. But do email us also on design@per.gov.ie, and we will send an email to all attendees reminding them of that. And Trevor kind of said there will be work done on this in the new year, and next year we will make these principles real and ready for implementation across public service. So again, if you're interested in being involved with that or want to find out more, keep in touch with us, follow us on LinkedIn, check out our website, and keep up to date on what we're doing with the design principles. And with that, I suppose we'll close out on today's event and another successful year for the Innovation Network. So thank you for joining us throughout the year. We'd wish you all a very Merry Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you in January. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Right.